Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome. It's been a while, and it's good to be back. We are now beginning volume 5, and I apologize to everyone who wanted the volume. I'll let you know after class how we can make those orders so we get them for us. We're going to very briefly touch upon refrigerators and freezers. And then we're going to go into one of the more fascinating discussions, which is how to use an oven. And I'll just preface my remarks by saying, if we asked our grandparents how they used an oven, guaranteed they did not have 2 wall ovens in their kitchens. So let's just say that this is something where there's definitely very much many permissible ways on how to use a single oven to use meat and milk. And we're going to see that later on. But for right at the beginning, let's touch upon refrigerators. And here we're going to talk about what happens if I've got in my refrigerator milk and I got some chicken in there and the milk spills onto the chicken. Now, is that now forbidden? I have to throw it out. It might well be it's disgusting for someone, so they may not want to have it. But let's imagine that there is no initial disgust. What can I do with that chicken? Can I rinse it off and eat it, or do I need to throw it out? So this is actually discussed in the Talmud. In Masechet Pesachim, on Ayin Vav Amud Aleph, on 76a, the Gemara there says, if you have a bar gozla, a young bird, the nafal lekada de kamka, that fell into a jug of kamka, which is actually very similar, or is in fact kutach. And kutach is something which has not so very nice to our ears or our taste buds. It's a little bit like rotten milk and rotten and stale bread. But apparently it was a Babylonian delicacy. It's called kutach, made of whey and stale bread. But again, whatever, for us it's a little bit not so nice, but for them it was a delicacy. So there you've got chicken is fallen into the milk. Says the Gemara there, Sharia Rav Chinana Brei de Rava me Pashronia. Rav Chanina, the son of Rava of the city of Parashnonia, he permitted it. Vahane mile, and when did he permit it? Chai, if this chicken or this bird was raw. About saleh, if the animal was already roasted. Ba'e klipa, one requires to remove the outer peel in order to eat it. Okay, and then the Gemara goes into a couple of more cases there about whether it was soft, whether it had cracks, whether it had spices. And the Gemara basically says, if it had cracks or if it had spices, if it had been cooked, there's problems. But if it's raw and nothing else, all you need to do is rinse off the meat, and you could eat it, no problem if any milk spilled onto the meat. So that's would be a relatively simple extrapolation that if poultry fell into a pot of milk, it would be permitted for consumption, assuming it's rinsed off from any milk residue. But this leniency is limited to whether poultry is raw, does not have cracks, and is not flavored with spices. If it is roasted or cooked as well, then at least the outer peel would be forbidden. However, the Rishonim dispute the parameters of the cases of roasted and flavored with spices. According to the Ran and Rashba, both of these refer only to a case where the meat or poultry is still hot. But if it is cooled down, i.e. that it was cooked and roasted then allowed to cool down to room temperature, it will be permitted after rinsing. And you can see that in the Ran there in source number 2.
Does that mean that it still has its skin on it?
Correct. It's been roasted, but it's no longer hot. It's cooled down, and it's got its skin on it. I'd assume so. Yeah, very good question, Sarah.
Hot and if it's hot, then it's treif?
Yeah, if it was hot, then we would say that that would be a problem. But here it's saying if it's cold, then it would be permitted. The Tosfot and the Rosh, quoted by the Bet Yosef in source number 3, says no. Once it's been roasted, even if it is cold, the very fact that it's been roasted, that becomes a problem, because once it's been roasted or cooked, then the meat becomes soft and it would have absorbed the flavor of the milk. And therefore, it doesn't matter how hot the food is, it's the fact that it's been roasted, and that would be the issue. So, moving to practical situation, the Shulchan Aruch follows like the Ran and says, Tzali roteach shenafal lemaliach, concerning hot roasted meat that fell into a salted dairy dish, afilu ne'echal machmat malcho, even if it can be eaten despite its salt, ba'e klipa, requires you to remove the outer layer. Vim yesh bo bekaim, but if there are cracks on it, or shehu metova betavlin, or it has had spices, or it is roasted and still hot, kulo asur, then it is all forbidden. The Ramah says, v'yesh omrim, da'afilu hem tzonenim, dina hacher, v'chein yesh linhog im en hefsed meubah. And then he says, even if they are cold, the halacha is the same, and this is how one should act if there is not a significant loss. So I'm reading all of this, and it seems that I would say, according to this, the halacha for Sfaradim, based on Maran, should be that cold chicken that has milk spilled on it should be permitted after rinsing it off. Whereas for Ashkenazim who follow the Ramah, it should be forbidden at least the outer peel. And that would be true even when it's cold. However, Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank writes in his Har Tzvi, and you can see this in detail in source number 5, we're not going to go into it, that since it's only a rabbinic prohibition, because I'm dealing with chicken and milk, and even if I want to say it's red meat and milk, I'm not dealing with actual cooking. I'm dealing with milk which has been poured or which has fallen onto the chicken or the meat, and therefore I've got two rabbinic issues, and therefore he says there is room to be lenient even for Ashkenazim. So there seems to be a room to say, if it's merely an issue where it's been spilt on it, all I would need to do is rinse it off. And if I want to be a little strict, maybe I'll pull off the outer layer. Now, the Gemara, we're going to talk about something called kavush, which means pickled, okay? Or something which has soaked for a long period of time. So let's say, for example, I didn't realize that the milk fell over the chicken. So the milk spilled onto the chicken. Or I didn't realize that the chicken fell into the milk dish. And it was there for a long period of time. It's soaking in there. We have a concept called kavush kemevushal. Soaking or pickling is like cooking. And therefore, says Shmuel, Amar Shmuel in the Gemara, Maliach harehu karateach, salting something is like boiling it. Kavush hare kemuvushal, and pickling something or soaking something is like cooking it. So if I marinate something for a long period of time, that's like cooking at it. We know that there is some sort of cooking process that goes there, even though it hasn't been heated or boiled. There's something to do with when you salt something. There's something when you soak something which has a transfer of flavor. Okay? The Gemara in Masechet Psachim on 44b says, V'Rabbanan mibasar b'chalav lo gamrinan dechidushu. From meat and milk we do not derive other prohibitions. as that prohibition is a chidush in itself, it's a novelty in itself. And what is the novelty? Umay chidush, ela de'itaru le kule yoma bechalva share b'shile b'shule asur. It says here, what is the novelty? That if one soaks meat in milk all day, it is permitted in Torah law, despite the fact the meat certainly absorbs some taste of the milk. Whereas if one cooked the meat in milk, even for a short time, the mixture is prohibited by Torah law. According to the Gemara then, basar b'chalav would only be forbidden when it's cooked. Therefore, this principle of kavush, of soaking, does not apply on a Torah level. This is pointed out by the Bet Yosef in source number 8. However, and you see here in source number 9, here it says at the end of here, however, the Bet Yosef later on quotes the Rosh, who argues, and he says, sorry, 1 second, I'm going too fast even for myself here. There's an issue here that this soaking period is not an issue if it's for a short period of time. However, if it soaks for an entire day, a 24-hour period, then even for meat and milk, we would say there is a transfer of taste. And therefore, if I discovered the meat and the milk together in the refrigerator, and I realized it's been soaking for a long time, over 24 hours, then I say that it is forbidden. The Rosh, in source number 9, quoted by the Bet Yosef, says, when it is something like brine, and it's something which is pickling, even less than 24 hours would be an issue. Okay? And here the Shulchan Aruch rules in source number 10, Isur, shenishra im heter met la'et betzonen. If something forbidden was soaked with something permitted, okay? They're soaked together in cold liquid for 24-hour periods. Mikre kavush, then it's called kavush, pickled or soaked. V'harehu kemevushan, it's considered as if it was cooked. V'ne'esa kulo, and all of it is forbidden. About bachot mikan, but if it's less than 24 hours, bahadacha sageh, it would be permitted if you would just rinse it off. Okay, now that's dealing with two liquids. What happens if I've got a liquid and a solid? The Ramah says, whenever we say that kavush, the soaking, is considered like being cooked, that's even what is outside the area of the soaking is forbidden, since through the soaking, underneath, it bubbles upward, just like with regard to a case of being soaked. And he says there are some who are lenient with what is outside, and in a case where it is uncertain if it was soaked, is forbidden, except for basar b'chalav, where we are lenient, since on a Torah level, only the actual cooking of the meat and milk is forbidden. So it would seem to be here that I could maybe be lenient, since again, where we're going through this, that on a Torah level, meat and milk is strictly speaking only prohibited when it's cooked. And we don't always need to apply this soaking concept. However, the Shach notes that some are lenient concerning what is outside the brine. And from the comments of the Ramah in the Torah Chatat, it seems that this is the accepted opinion that we can be lenient. Okay, and the Pri Begadim gives another way to be lenient, which says if it's two solids, the meat is solid and the milk is solid, so let's imagine a piece of meat and a piece of cheese, then again, even if they're there for a long period of time, we could perhaps be lenient there also. Okay, so just to sum up before we go into ovens, which is why most of us are here and most of us are interested in this topic, when it comes to a refrigerator situation, if it's a short period of time, less than 24 hours, and I realize there's a spill, all that one would need to do is rinse it off. If that meat had been cooked or roasted, then it's good to take off the outside layer. Regarding pickling or soaking, if it's more than 24 hours, I have a problem. If it's less than 24 hours, I could rinse it off, especially if it's a solid or it's two solids. And if it's a solid and a liquid, if it's not something which is a salty thing, so it's not something like a brine or anything else, then also I could rinse it off. But again, these are not common scenarios. What comes up much more commonly is what we're going to discuss right now, which is using an oven. And can I use the same oven for meat and for milk? Now, this topic is as old as the hills, and much has changed throughout history of what is considered an oven, both in the time of the Mishnah and Gemara, to what it was in the time of the Rishonim, to what it was in the time of the Shulchan Aruch and Ramah, to the Achronim, to our ovens today. So it's very important that we actually understand how our ovens cook and bake so that we can truly understand what's happening. Okay? So there are a number of potential halachic issues with using an oven for both meat and dairy, but the primary one is ze'ah, which we're going to call steam. If one cooks dairy and meat in the oven at the same time, the steam from one may circulate throughout the oven and be absorbed by the other. The question is whether ze'ah, steam, which is not actual tangible food, is considered significant or not. According to the Rosh, who I've told you before, the Rosh lived in Germany and he moved to Spain, and he was so well respected by the Sfaradim that they made him the Av Bet Din down there, and he was very, very important in the early 15th century, very much well respected rabbi. And what we love about the Rosh is he knows all of Ashkenazic practice and all of the Sephardic practice as well. So we pay very close attention to the Rosh, who was the father of the Torah. And we know that the Shulchan Aruch of Yosef Cairo, he made his commentary on the Torah, the Beit Yosef. So the Rosh is a very important commentary, okay? He's one of the three big halachic deciders. The Shulchan Aruch bases his halacha, and those are the Rambam, the Rif, and the third one being the Rosh. So we take his words very, very seriously, okay? So let's read this together in English. It says this: what you asked concerning whether it's permitted to place a dairy pan on the bottom of the oven underneath a pot of meat, it seems to me that it is forbidden, even b'diavad, after the fact, if it was done. I would forbid the meat pot, since the steam, the ze'ah, that rises from the pan is like milk. As we learned in the Mishnah in the 2nd chapter of Machshirin, the steam of an impure bathhouse is impure, but that of a pure bathhouse comes under the law of if water be put. If there was a pool in a house and the house is steaming because of it, the pool was impure. All of the steam of the house, which was caused by its impure. So here, it's very interesting. He's learning out the laws of Tumah and Tahara, of purity and impurity, to apply those cases to our scenario of meat and milk. But what they're saying is, what is the commonality of the two? That the steam does impact, just like it impacts it for purity and impurity, so too it should impact it here in the case of meat and milk. That the steam from the milk should have an impact on the meat. We also learned there, a man's perspiration does not cause susceptibility to uncleanness. If a man drank impure water and perspired, his perspiration does not cause susceptibility to uncleanness. If he entered into drawn water and perspired, his perspiration causes susceptibility to uncleanness. From all of these, it is evident that the steam that emerges from an item is considered like that item. So what he's trying to say here is, although we don't normally learn out impurity and purity to meat and milk laws, on this occasion, we're learning it out. The kashrut can be learned from that area. Okay? The Shulchan Aruch cites the Rosh and rules in accordance with his opinion. He says as follows in source 16. Machavat shel chalav, a dairy pan, shenatnog b'kira tachat kedera shel basar, that was placed in an oven underneath a pot of meat. Haze'ah ola v'nivla b'kedera v'osarta. The steam rises and is absorbed in the pot, and it becomes forbidden. The Ramah, though, limits the halacha in a case where the pan is uncovered and the pot is in sufficiently close proximity that the steam will still be quite hot when coming into contact with the meat pot. Only in this case, the steam can rise naturally and come in contact with the meat pot and the food inside. Therefore, the steam is halachically equivalent to the actual dairy food. So here the Ramah wants to limit the case to what's going on where the milk pan is uncovered and the steam which is rising from the food itself is going very carefully. It's very hot. It's over Yad Soledet, and that steam is touching the pot. So he adds, if ein hayad soledet b'ze'ah, hakol shareh. If the steam is not at that point where my hand would want to withdraw because it was so hot, because I would get scalded, then it would be permitted. And Rabbi Akiva Eger here, one of the Ashkenazic Achronim, says, Shayad soledet b'ze'ah, im ein hayad soledet b'ze'ah, mutar im lo shakadera rotachat b'fnei atzma. When the steam is the temperature of yad soledet, but if the steam is not at that temperature, it is permitted unless the pot is also boiling. So here, we want to try and understand our scenario, okay, which is, it seems from what the Ramah is saying, what is our problem if they're both steaming and they are both uncovered? So if I have my oven and I have uncovered meat, I have uncovered dairy, and steam is coming out from both of them, then I have an issue. But what happens if one of them is covered? What happens if they're not being cooked at the same time? Could I then use the same oven for both meat and for milk? It would seem that there are definitely positions to allow this. Okay, so let's have a look at this. There are 4 approaches that we're going to see for our modern ovens. And the first position is by the Aruch HaShulchan and Rav Herzl Schechter, who is so the Aruch HaShulchan lived in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And Rav Herzl Schechter is a contemporary posek for Yeshiva University. And a lot of rabbis from the RCA, Rabbinical Council of America, lean on him for halachic rulings. He writes, the Aruch HaShulchan is lenient to allow cooking meat and dairy uncovered consecutively in modern ovens, which are larger ovens in the time of the Gemara and in the time of the Rishonim. He explains that the steam, the ze'ah referred to by the Rosh in the Shulchan Aruch, was a very thick steam that resulted from the space being small and enclosed. But that is not the case in our larger ovens, which have sufficient ventilation allowing the steam to exit. So here, The Aruch HaShulchan rules in source number 21, concerning the halacha of steam, it is clarified for us in the Mishnah that ze'ah only applies in an enclosed area, but not in an open area, like in an enclosed stove, where the lower pot is placed in it and the upper one stands on top of it, and the steam goes around and around since there's no place to exit. But in an open area, like in our ovens, where there is air, the steam rises in the air and does not forbid the post next to it. Rav Chaim Jachter, who is a rabbi in New Jersey, writes that Rav Herzl Schechter also adopts this approach as the practical halacha. According to the approach of the Aruch HaShulchan, one would be permitted to cook milk and meat consecutively in the same oven, provided the oven is clean. The cleanliness of the oven eliminates the problem of reach, of smell or taste, and the fact that we do not cook in small confined areas removes the problem of ze'ah, of steam. Rav Schechter routinely tells inquirers that they may adopt this approach. Rav Schechter reasons that the problem of steam applies only to hevel, which is thick steam, an assertion supported by the Biur Hagra. Rav Schechter counsels, however, that one wait for the oven to cool down from dairy use before the meat use, and vice versa. According to this approach, steam would only be present with the type of thick steam that sometimes appears when food or liquid spills on the bottom of the oven and begins to burn. Rav Yosef Kapach also takes a similar approach in his commentary to the Rambam's Mishneh Torah. And he says here, it seems to me that it is entirely permitted to bake meat and dairy in an electric oven with one compartment, obviously with separate pans, and one after the other and not together. And one who wishes to practice an extra stringency should heat up the oven for 15 minutes between cooked foods to burn out their aroma if one thinks that it was absorbed into the walls. One need not be concerned at all for reicha that is absorbed, since reicha is not significant. In addition, there is no contact between the door of the oven and the item that is being baked or roasted. So I just want to stop here and explain this to you, okay? Because sometimes, and it bothers me a great deal, that we all try to do the best that we can, and we want to be as accommodating to everyone who comes to our homes, so we try to go to the most strict position possible. Here, the Aruch HaShulchan and Rav Schechter, who's no small rabbi by any stretch of the imagination, and Rav Chaim Jachter, who is a very well-renowned rabbi in New Jersey, and known to our community, explain that one can, and this is the most lenient of all the positions we're going to see, you can cook milk in your oven and then turn off the oven, allow the oven to cool down, turn on the oven to preheat, and you can then use that same oven to roast whatever meat you want to do. And that's as simple as it goes. And we say the steam from the oven, or the smell, or the taste, or the flavor emitting from the oven is not significant whatsoever. So for Ashkenazim, that seems to be a very straightforward position, okay? And it's something which I recommend to people who are becoming new to observance. I say to them, you don't need to go and get 2 new ovens. You don't need to spend thousands of dollars remodeling your kitchen. You can use the same oven, and guess what? You don't even need to wait 24 hours. All you need to do is make sure the oven cools down and then turn it on. So if you're making a meat meal, easy, and then the next time you're making a dairy meal, you're doing it. And if you're making your preparations and you want to make a meat meal and a dairy meal for Shabbat, you just got to time it so that you're not doing it. And all this assumes, yes, so the oven stays clean in between cooking. So if you have an issue where there's been some sort of spillage going on there, then you would need to clean that either by turning the oven onto self-clean or by cleaning it out using one of those oven cleaners, which harder to do, but that's a way to do so. But here, that first approach, it doesn't require a waiting time. All that's required is that the oven cools down, and that's Rav Herzl Schechter, Rav Chaim Schachter, and the Aruch HaShulchan. Now, if that you're not comfortable with because it seems to be too lenient, I'll give you the second approach. And the second approach is by Hacham Ovadia Yosef and also Rav Aaron Lichtenstein. Okay? He says as follows. Concerning the question about a gas or electric oven where meat is occasionally roasted and they see that the oven fills with steam from the roast, is it permissible to bake cakes filled with cheese and the like afterwards in a separate tray designated for dairy foods? How does he answer? Yesh lahatir. One is allowed to do so, achar me'et le'et, if one waits 24 hours from the time that one roasted the meat in a tray designated especially for dairy foods, on condition that the oven is turned on before baking for 20 minutes or so, such that the heat of the oven will remove the small amount of ze'ah, if there is any in the oven. And one should not protest against those who are lenient concerning food even within 24 hours, as they have what to rely upon. I want to stop here again and bring us all back together. 1 second. Hear me again. What does Hacham Ovadia say here? What's the best way to rule? Wait 24 hours between the meat and using the dairy, and again, preheat the oven for 20 minutes. So how did he conclude? Those who wish to be lenient and not wait 24 hours, they have whom to rely upon. So here we have two positions where it's entirely fine to use one oven. One is don't have them cooking at the same time and just let the oven cool down in between. And the other one is, okay, make sure you know when you finish roasting the meat or cooking the meat, wait 24 hours, and then use that same oven for dairy, making sure you're using dairy, whatever, either using the dairy roasting racks or you're using disposables like silver foils or whatever you're going to do. So here I have two positions. Any questions on this so far before we look at the third and fourth positions? Straightforward so far? Okay.
I have a question, Rabbi.
Yes.
So if it's vice versa, that you've done dairy first, the same thing applies.
Yes. Wait 24 hours in between. Yeah.
Okay.
Do you need to run the self-clean after the 24 hours or before the 24 hours, or is it just leave the oven as is?
Just leave it at this. Just 20 minutes, turn it up. So if you just turn it to 400.
Regardless of how dirty it could be? Like if there was meat splatter or we don't know?
If there's splattering, you should clean it out. But again, when you open the oven and see if there's any splattering, if there's no splattering, there's no splattering.
Okay.
So how I guess the definition of clean, like what is the bar to meet? So when we say that the oven needs to be clean, what is the bar to meet? I don't know.
Like the standard? Okay, so Benjamin thinks that we need to run a self-clean between meat and dairy and then wait 24 hours. Like scrub it with the oven cleaner and run the self-clean and then wait 24 hours before you can change from one to another.
It's a great question. I would say it's normal. Again, I'm not the one who cooks mostly in my house, so I'm not the best for practically speaking what happens. but I do look at my oven and I don't see that much splattering going on in my oven.
Got it.
But again, everyone has to know how they're cooking. If you know that you made something which splattered all over the place, and it's meat or it's dairy, I think it's a good idea if you're going to use your oven like this to clean it thoroughly. I think it's one of those things. There's a trade-off, which is if you're going to use your oven like this, you might have to use the self-cleaning function or clean it out thoroughly more regularly, but you're going to save yourself the hassle of needing two ovens. So it's much cheaper on the remodel, but it might be more hassle in making sure it's clean.
That's right. Cool. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. So let's go back to the notes here. So again, Raham Ovadia is no lenient rabbi. That's why I always like quoting the sources here, so you don't think that I'm cherry picking to create lenient positions here. These are all heavy hitters so far. Okay, let's move on to the third position. The third position is Ramosha Feinstein, okay? One of the greatest Ashkenazic rabbis of America of the last generation. And he takes a stricter approach. In his view, one may not cook uncovered meat and dairy foods, even consecutively. He holds that one would need to designate the oven as being dairy or meat, and then cover the other type of food on a regular basis. So this, and I want to share you with this, which is very important. Just hold on a second. This is very important, which is how rabbis become, their positions become the dominant approach. This position, which we're going to see, or what's known as Rav Moshe's position, became normative halacha in America, not only for Ashkenazim, but also for Sephardim, mainly because Sephardim were in smaller communities and they took on the standards of the Ashkenazic communities. Rav Moshe Feinstein held, if you're going to have your oven for meat, then the dairy must be covered. It doesn't matter how long you wait, okay, unless you're running the self-clean function. The self-clean function is a game changer because you're basically rendering it back to being never used. But here, if we look again in the Rav Moshe's position here, he explains concerning the ovens in this country, whether there is a concern of steam when cooking a meat dish that is uncovered to forbid cooking an uncovered dairy dish afterward. Therefore, if there was steam, cooking an uncovered meat dish and a dairy dish may not be permitted, even consecutively when there is a lot of time in between. Lachen, I see that in Hebrew. Im haya ze'ah, ein lehatil levashel tavshil basar v'tavshil chalav megulin, af bezeh achazeh lezman merubeh. Even as a long time. But I am unsure if we are generally concerned with steam because of the language of the Ramah. But if one baked them one after the other, there was no concern unless the pan gave out steam from both of them, as then it's forbidden even when it is one after the other if both were uncovered. It seems that there is no concern for steam in standard cases, and it is known that both of them are steaming. But it is possible that with respect to these ovens nowadays, where the roof and walls are sealed, they certainly produce steam or are more inclined to have steam. Therefore, one should be stringent practically, not to cook with uncovered pots in the oven. According to Rav Moshe, although it is true that the Ramah implies that we do not necessarily assume that steam is always produced, in today's ovens that have walls and a roof, there is usually steam and we must be stringent. Rav Moshe, though, is more lenient concerning dry foods, which he believes do not usually produce steam. Therefore, he permits placing an uncovered, totally dry dairy food in an oven, usually used for meat, unless one actually sees steam emerging from the oven. Okay, so if it's going to be, he would normally hold, if you're going to do anything dairy, if it's going to steam, you need to cover it. But if it's dairy and it's solid and it doesn't steam, then you can use it. And he says here, now if dishes with liquid were not cooked in the oven, but only dry foods without liquid were baked or cooked, and he quotes the Pri Megadim, that the steam of solids does not forbid, but he writes it using a formulation of possibly, meaning that he is unsure practically. But if it is totally dry, it seems that he is not uncertain at all and would definitely permit it. If so, one may permit baking or cooking dry foods alone consecutively, even when there is steam. But nevertheless, practically one should be strict if there certainly is steam. Though in a standard case, one need not be concerned that perhaps the dry food emitted steam, and it is permitted in the standard case if it is zeh achar zeh, if it is consecutive. So, does one who follows this approach need to switch their racks when cooking the other type in the oven? Rabbi Binyamin Forst, in his, it's a very machmir English book called, I think it's called The Laws of Kashrus with an S, but I haven't, it's not in my library, but I think we have it in the SPH library, believe it or not. Notes that this issue is subject to an argument, to a machloket, but offers a suggestion as to how to circumvent the question. And he says here, placing meat utensils on the same racks as dairy utensils poses no problem in itself. Taste cannot travel from utensil to utensil without the medium of liquid. Nevertheless, use of the same oven racks for meat and dairy pots can at times be problematic because of the occasional spills which takes place. Therefore, one should be concerned, and therefore he recommends using the same oven but having separate racks. And that is only if the items aren't producing steam. Again, going back to if they're going to produce steam, we go back to what Igrat Moshe said there, or Ramosha Feinstein said, which is you need to have, it's considered a meat oven and you cover the dairy, or it's a dairy oven and you cover the meat. Okay, so far we've seen three approaches. Approach number one is the Aruch HaShulchan, which is quoted by Rav Herzl Schechter, and that is all you need to do is wait for the oven to cool down, and then you can go and cook the dairy if meat was cooked previously. You don't need to wait 24 hours. We had approach number two, which was by Hacham Ovadia, which is use the oven for meat and for milk. Just wait 24 hours in between each. Then we had approach number three, which was Ramosha Feinstein, which is no, you need to make your oven a meat oven, or you need to make your oven a dairy oven. And whatever you're going to do separate, you need to cover it if it's going to produce steam. If there are dry foods and they don't produce steam, then you're okay, but you should be careful, it says Rav Binyamin Forst, with the racks, and you may want to have separate racks. But those are approaches 1, 2, and 3. And what I'm just suggesting to you here is that approach number 3 has become almost the normal position, whereas approach number 1 and number 2, people don't know about. But there's certainly, approach number 2 is certainly fine. And even approach number 1, yeah, as Hacham Ovadia said, yesh al ma lismach, there is what to rely on with that position. In approach number 4, some poskim are even more stringent than Rav Moshe and do not recommend cooking dairy foods in a meat oven even if they are covered. This is based on a comment of the Ramah to avoid having a meat and dairy pot come into contact with each other lechatchila. So too, one should not allow steam from the meat oven to come into contact with the cover of a dairy dish. So the Ramah says, if the pan is covered, hakol shareh, everything is permitted. Mindei dahave ashte kederot nogot zo bazo, den osrin ze benegia, kol sheken bezeah. Mihu lechatchila yesh li zaheh bechol zeh. He basically says there's no problem whatsoever of two pots touching each other if they're covered. And we have no concern about the steam since they're covered. However, ideally, one should be careful about this. And he's saying, since ideally one should be careful about this, perhaps it will not be covered well, and perhaps since it's not fully covered, some steam might come out, and therefore they said, be careful. Even if you cover it by making sure there's a cover on the dairy, or even if you make sure the foil is covering the foil, perhaps something will come out, and therefore, Rav Moshe Sternbach quoted here in source number 31, and the Badei HaShulchan says, you know what? The best thing to do is just to have separate ovens. Never, ever, 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 ever put dairy in a meat oven, even if it's covered. Never, ever, ever put vice versa. And so therefore, you stop until here, and we're gonna stop my sharing. We stop here, and we create ourselves a situation where, out of fear and out of ignorance, we can create our situation where we only think that situations 3 and 4 are the only approaches we can live by. Whereas we go back to our parents or our grandparents, they had Yirat Shamayim, they kept kashrut 100%, and guaranteed they only had one oven, and they knew how to use it. So I'm saying, I'm not telling you, go to the most lenient position if you've been doing the strictest position. I'm saying we don't need to look down upon people who use those positions. I have many times, I've had people who've become more observant in their college years or in their gap years to Israel, and they say, I don't think my parents keep kashrut because they only use one oven. And what I learned in yeshiva is you have to wait 24 hours. And I said to them, do you think that's the only position out there? Could it not possibly be that they are using a different position that you're not familiar with? And I expressed to them, there are 4 positions. The first position being, just don't cook them together uncovered. The second position, wait 24 hours. The third position, only have a meat oven, only have a dairy oven, unless it's dry. And the fourth position being, even if things are covered, even if they're dry, you've got to have a milk oven and a meat oven, no matter what. So my intent tonight, and I hope I've done so, is to express a limud zechut, that we can learn that even people who we think might not be doing it properly, provided that they're not cooking meat and milk where everything is uncovered at the same time, then guess what? It's not a problem of meat and milk. Now, we're not personally comfortable with that and we want to wait 24 hours. Tavo aleinu bracha, then that should be a blessing for us that we wish to be strict. But we should not feel that the only way that someone keeps kashrut today is by having a separate meat oven and a separate milk oven. It certainly makes it easier and you don't have to think about it, but it's certainly not necessary. Are there any questions about any of the things that we talked about? Okay.
I just want to introduce myself. My name's Aryeh. My first class coming on to here, so hello.
Hi, welcome.
Yeah.
I hope you liked it.
Yeah, I actually found out about this Sephardic Brotherhood of America by I have a